It's actually the people around the whole world logging onto Netflix last night to find not one, not two, but 3 episodes from the new Harry and Meghan documentary. And after years of speculation, we got to hear their side of the story, their relationship, and also what happens beyond the tabloid.
Christmas at Windsor was meant to project unity, tradition, and absolute control. Instead, one seemingly ordinary moment inside the banquet room left senior royal aides deeply unsettled. By the following morning, staff were comparing accounts, reconstructing conversations, and asking why Meghan had been involved in a private exchange that was never meant to become part of the evening. What they uncovered transformed a festive gathering into a quiet palace crisis and placed one question above every other. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles entered the fictional Windsor Christmas banquet, hoping warmth could overpower tension. Camilla stayed close, while William and Catherine kept conversation measured, and Harry remained watchful beside Meghan. The household had separated private family talk from official duties, a boundary designed to separate personal conversation from staff work. Restricted family correspondence meant private letters, emails, or internal messages kept away from casual access, and it was never meant to become banquet conversation. William felt the temperature change the next morning when a senior aide described what staff had reconstructed. Meghan, the aide said, had held an unscheduled conversation with a household employee about older Windsor communications and whether copies were retained. The prince did not react, because she had spoken to an employee. He reacted to the subject. Catherine noticed his face tighten as he asked whether the question had been casual. Harry initially brushed the exchange aside. He argued that curiosity was not misconduct. Then the aide specified the correspondence being discussed, and his confidence faltered. The Duke understood that old internal communications could touch earlier disputes, and wounds nobody believed were fully healed. Meghan had not been accused of taking anything, but even asking where such material remained could cross an invisible family line. 2 aides later gave separate documented accounts of the same detail. Meghan had asked whether older Windsor communications were still kept by individual staff members rather than Christmas arrangements. A senior courtier remembered approaching during the exchange and hearing the subject change almost immediately. That timing did not prove intent, but it sharpened the suspicion inside the household. Charles received the verbal briefing before breakfast and listened without interrupting. The king set down his untouched cup and asked for the names of everyone close enough to hear the conversation. Camilla watched him carefully. William waited for what would come next. Harry knew the issue had escaped the banquet room. But before the monarch could decide what Meghan's conversation meant, the palace had to confront something more dangerous, the personal history now pulling every one of them back into old wounds. The discovery mattered because this was never simply about one conversation. Beneath it sat years of fractured trust, painful departures, family accusations, and wounds that Christmas hospitality could not erase. For Charles, the issue touched his authority. For William, it touched the protection of his household. For Harry, it reopened the divide between loyalty to his wife and loyalty to the family he had spent years challenging. And for Meghan, the stakes had suddenly become intensely personal. Charles had entered the fictional Windsor gathering, believing the family might finally prove that peace, however fragile, was still possible. The king had accepted that warmth would not erase the past, but he hoped shared tradition might at least create a workable truce. William understood that hope, yet he also knew how quickly trust could collapse between him and Harry. Protocol, in this context, simply meant the agreed boundaries governing how family members and staff handled sensitive royal matters. Even a small breach could therefore feel much larger than it looked. Harry confronted William before the tension could harden further. The Duke insisted Meghan had no malicious intention, and accused his brother of interpreting every uncertain action through suspicion. His voice sharpened as he spoke. William did not raise his own. The prince answered that intention was only part of the problem. Private family material remained private for a reason, and serving staff could not become informal routes into information that others were expected to respect. Catherine entered just as Harry's frustration peaked. She heard the final sentence and stopped, immediately sensing how far the argument had moved beyond the original conversation. The princess then remembered something she had noticed earlier that evening. Meghan had asked whether household records remained at Windsor after staffing changes. Household records meant internal material kept by royal staff to manage family and official matters. Catherine admitted the question had sounded unusually precise, though she had not thought much of it at the time. Camilla added another troubling detail through a private conversation with Charles later that morning. The Queen recalled seeing a senior courtier approach Meghan during the banquet and noticing her step away almost immediately afterward. She did not claim to know what had been said, but the timing matched the documented accounts already being compared. Charles listened carefully, because each detail now seemed to reinforce the others. Then a senior aide changed everything. He told the king that questions about old correspondence had surfaced once before, and Meghan had been involved in that earlier exchange too. That incident had once looked like awkward curiosity. After Windsor, it looked very different, and the palace began tracing the crisis back to the moment that may have crossed the line first. Every royal crisis has a moment that looks insignificant until something later gives it meaning. Months before the Windsor banquet, one private exchange had raised eyebrows and then quietly disappeared into palace memory. No statement followed. No confrontation occurred. But now aides were returning to that forgotten conversation and examining every word again. What once looked like curiosity suddenly appeared connected to the Christmas discovery, and one specific question Meghan had asked became the trigger nobody could ignore anymore. Meghan had spoken briefly with a former royal household employee during a fictional family reception months earlier, and few considered the exchange important. The former staff member had once handled archival correspondence, meaning private letters, emails, and official records preserved for reference, but no longer held an active palace role. That detail mattered, because the gathering was informal, and because the employee had already stepped away from operations. The conversation seemed harmless enough to fade into the background. Then the remembered wording changed everything. Meghan had asked whether copies of private communications involving Harry and senior royals from the period before their departure were still preserved anywhere outside the central household system. The former employee later gave a documented fictional account of the exchange when aides began reconstructing the timeline after Windsor. What unsettled them was not simply that she had asked about old records. It was that retained correspondence had now surfaced as a theme, twice, months apart, under different circumstances. Harry heard about the earlier question only after the review reached him, and the news hit harder than anyone expected. He did not immediately accuse Meghan of wrongdoing. He looked shaken by the fact that she had never mentioned it. In their private conversation, he listened as she explained that she had wanted to know what still existed because she feared old communications could one day be selectively used against them. She insisted the concern had been defensive, not secretive. Harry listened, then sat down slowly, and asked the question that carried more pain than anger. Why had she never told him? Meghan tried to explain that, at the time, she had believed the exchange too minor to matter. But another detail now made that defense harder to absorb. The former employee remembered her asking whether one senior aide attached to William's household had retained personal copies. Suddenly, the issue no longer belonged only to Harry and Meghan. It had crossed directly into the prince's circle, and William reacted with immediate suspicion when the name reached him through the internal review. By that evening, William no longer wanted summaries, timelines, or second-hand accounts. He wanted Meghan in the room, and he wanted the question answered face-to-face. When William finally entered the room, the atmosphere had already changed. Harry was beside Meghan. Catherine remained close enough to hear everything. No press office stood between them. No aide could reinterpret the words later, and no ceremonial politeness could make the subject disappear. The future king wanted one answer. Why had Meghan asked two different people, months apart, about private royal correspondence? Her response did not end the confrontation. It made it more complicated. William believed the repeated interest in retained correspondence had crossed into something his household could no longer ignore. His household meant the private team responsible for supporting his official duties, communications, and personal royal work. So any concern involving former aides or saved messages immediately touched questions of privacy. Harry refused to let the conversation begin without him. He made it clear that if Meghan was being questioned, he would stay beside her, and the tension between the brothers sharpened before the first real accusation had even landed. William leaned forward and asked Meghan directly whether she had been trying to locate archived messages involving the royal family. Harry started to interrupt, but she raised one hand and answered for herself. Meghan said she had been trying to understand what information remained in circulation, not trying to obtain it. She insisted there was a difference between knowing that records existed and asking someone to deliver them. The prince listened, but his expression did not soften. To him, the secrecy surrounding the earlier conversation was precisely why the issue could no longer be dismissed as casual curiosity. Harry reacted immediately. He accused William of taking uncertainty and turning it into guilt before anyone had produced proof of wrongdoing. His brother pushed back, arguing that two separate conversations about retained correspondence created a pattern that demanded explanation. Meghan then confirmed the second question openly. Yes, she had asked at Windsor whether old correspondence still existed. But she insisted she had never asked anyone to hand over a letter, message, email, or private file. Catherine finally stepped into the argument with a distinction neither side could easily ignore. She said asking whether records existed was one thing, asking someone to retrieve or surrender them was another. More importantly, the palace still had no evidence that Meghan had done the second. William heard the point, but remained convinced the repeated questions required action. Harry seized on Catherine's reasoning as proof that suspicion had outrun facts. The confrontation produced anger, but not proof. William left believing Charles now had to act, while Harry believed the lack of evidence should end the escalation. And that left the king facing the most dangerous question yet. How far could royal authority go when suspicion was stronger than evidence? Charles now faced the kind of decision monarchs rarely escape cleanly. If he ignored the episode, William would believe the boundaries around his household meant nothing. If he treated curiosity as misconduct, Harry would see confirmation that Meghan had already been judged before the facts were settled. Somewhere between those extremes sat the truth. And behind a closed door at Windsor, the king finally made the distinction that would determine what happened next. Charles read the chronology slowly, refusing to let emotion race ahead of evidence. The document separated what aides had personally heard from what people later remembered, while marking anything uncertain as inference rather than established conduct. A chronology, in plain terms, was simply a step-by-step record of events arranged in the order they happened. That distinction mattered because he was not only a father trying to stop another family fracture, he was also the monarch, and every response carried consequences far beyond one argument. Camilla found him after the briefing and immediately saw the strain. The Queen listened as Charles admitted that every path seemed designed to hurt one of his sons. William wanted stronger protection around his household. Harry wanted proof that Meghan would not be condemned simply because suspicion had taken hold. The king confessed that the Christmas gathering had been meant to show the family could still sit together without reopening every wound. Instead, the fragile peace had collapsed almost as soon as it began. Camilla urged restraint. She warned Charles that punishing Meghan for questions alone would turn uncertainty into a verdict, and might deepen the divide beyond repair. The Queen did not dismiss William's concern, but she insisted concern and proof were not the same thing. Her words forced the monarch back toward the one standard he could defend to everyone. Charles returned to the briefing and reached the critical finding. No aide had produced evidence that Meghan received, copied, removed, or possessed private correspondence. What existed was evidence that she had repeatedly asked whether older material still remained available. That was enough to justify a boundary, but not enough to justify an accusation. The king closed the folder, pushed it away, and made his decision. Staff would no longer discuss historical private correspondence with any family member outside formal channels. Formal channels meant approved household routes, where sensitive requests could be recorded, reviewed, and handled consistently. The rule would apply to everyone. Meghan would not be singled out. William heard the decision and did not hide his disappointment. The prince believed caution had become weakness, and he asked to speak to his father alone. That distinction protected Meghan from the harshest interpretation, but it did nothing to calm William, and the next conversation would leave father and son more divided than before. The official decision was restrained. The personal fallout was not. William saw a pattern that frightened him. Harry saw a family preparing to distrust his wife, regardless of what the evidence showed. Between them stood years of unfinished resentment, now concentrated into a single Christmas dispute. And when Charles told both sons that no formal accusation would be made, their opposite reactions revealed how far apart the brothers had truly become. Charles delivered the conclusion carefully, because he knew one careless sentence could deepen the fracture. The king told William and Harry that no evidence showed private correspondence had been acquired, copied, or removed. He also confirmed a new household protocol, meaning a clear set of rules staff would now follow when sensitive matters arose. Employees were no longer to discuss archived family communications informally with relatives. Every question would have to pass through an approved channel, closing the very gap that had allowed the controversy to begin. William heard caution where his father intended fairness. The prince told Charles that the repeated questions themselves formed a pattern, and that waiting for documents to disappear before acting would mean protecting the household too late. He was not accusing Meghan of theft. He was arguing that boundaries only mattered if they were defended before something irreversible happened. The king listened, but refused to turn suspicion into punishment simply to ease his son's fear. Harry reacted from the opposite direction. The Duke felt relieved that no misconduct finding had been made, yet the relief quickly hardened into anger. He could not accept that Meghan's conversations had been reconstructed, compared, and treated almost like evidence when nothing had been taken. Harry told Charles that his wife had become the center of an internal inquiry because people already expected the worst from her. The king rejected that interpretation, but he could hear how deeply the process had wounded his younger son. Meghan made her own decision away from the argument. She removed an upcoming private family engagement from her diary while Harry watched, and told him quietly that she would not keep entering Windsor rooms where every sentence might later be examined for hidden meaning. He did not challenge her. The Duke understood that the decision was less about anger than exhaustion, and that made it harder to dismiss. Charles received the news, and finally allowed his disappointment to show. The Christmas gathering had been meant to rebuild contact, yet the king now saw it pushing Harry's household further away. Catherine noticed something else. She privately told William that certainty was beginning to outrun evidence, and urged him to speak to his brother once more, without Meghan, without Charles, and without palace staff. Catherine's intervention changed the direction of the crisis, because what came next was no longer about Meghan's questions. It was about whether two brothers could still speak honestly without an institution standing between them. For the first time since the Christmas dispute began, nobody else was in the room. No aides, no spouses, no king. William and Harry sat opposite each other, with nothing to hide behind but years of memory and resentment. The conversation began with Meghan, but it did not stay there. Within minutes, both brothers were speaking about something far deeper, the fear that every disagreement between them had become evidence of betrayal before either man had even explained himself. William had accepted Catherine's suggestion because he knew another formal meeting would achieve nothing. The prince told Harry immediately that this was not an interrogation and that he had not invited him there to force an admission. A formal channel, the route approved for handling sensitive household concerns, had already been established. What remained now was personal. Harry stayed guarded, but the Duke agreed to talk because he wanted one point finally understood. Asking whether records existed was not the same as attempting to obtain them. William struggled before saying what had driven his reaction so hard. He admitted that hearing someone connected to his household had been specifically mentioned made him instinctively protective. The future king feared that private boundaries might be tested before anyone understood what was happening. Harry listened without interrupting, then admitted something of his own. Learning only after Windsor that Meghan had previously asked about old correspondence had disturbed him too. The Duke believed her explanation, but he could not pretend the secrecy had looked good. William finally stopped defending his first instinct. The prince said the evidence available to them did not justify claiming Meghan had tried to obtain private correspondence. He could still dislike the questions. He could still believe they were inappropriate. But suspicion was not proof, and he admitted he had allowed the possibility of a breach to feel like certainty before the facts supported it. Harry stayed silent when his brother added, "I was afraid of what it might mean before I knew what it did mean." The Duke waited several seconds before answering that it was the first thing William had said since the dispute began that felt fair. The anger between them did not disappear, but something inside the conversation changed. For once, neither man was trying to win. Harry then offered his own reassurance. He promised he would personally tell Meghan that any future concern about royal records had to go through the approved household process, never current or former staff. William accepted that promise without adding another condition. The brothers made one final decision together. Instead of sending separate messages, they would approach Charles jointly and tell him they accepted the distinction and wanted the matter closed. For the first time, the family had something stronger than suspicion, a boundary both brothers could accept. But outside Windsor, the story had already escaped into a world far less interested in nuance. Inside the palace, the dispute was finally cooling. Outside it, the opposite was happening. The leaked account transformed a private Christmas conversation into a public drama about trust, privacy, Meghan, and the fractured relationship between Harry and William. Headlines stripped away distinctions that had taken the family days to establish. Within hours, the most complicated part of the story became the least convenient one. There was concern, there were questions, but there was no finding that Meghan took anything. Charles refused to let the palace answer emotion with emotion. The king approved only a narrow clarification, stating that household confidentiality procedures had been reinforced and that no evidence showed private correspondence had been transferred. Confidentiality procedures, in simple terms, were the rules controlling who could discuss or access sensitive family information. The monarch understood why restraint mattered. A personal attack might satisfy angry voices for a day, but it could destroy the fragile progress William and Harry had just made behind closed doors. Meghan felt that restraint was almost invisible beside the headlines. She read coverage that treated the Banquet exchange as though guilt had already been proven and told Harry that everything the family had finally separated in private had been crushed together in public. The Duke understood her anger because he had fought for that distinction himself. Yet he also knew something had changed. William was no longer allowing suspicion to be presented as certainty. William reacted sharply when he saw reports describing the episode as a proven attempt to obtain restricted material. The prince had raised serious concerns from the beginning, but he did not want those concerns turned into a claim the evidence could not support. He backed stronger wording in the palace clarification, insisting it explicitly state that no documents had been shown to Meghan, copied for her, or passed into her possession. Outside Windsor Castle, the story became impossible to contain. Visitors gathered behind the barriers, while a television broadcaster held up a newspaper front page dominated by the words, "Christmas Trust Crisis." The phrase spread instantly, reducing days of painful family argument to 3 explosive words. Harry saw the broadcast. Meghan watched beside him in silence, exhausted by how quickly private tension had become public spectacle. Harry then told her something she had not expected. William had personally supported the clarification, protecting the distinction between asking questions and actually receiving documents. Meghan paused before admitting that the future king did not have to do that. For the first time since the dispute began, her anger toward him softened slightly. Charles saw the same moment differently. The king knew public damage could not be reversed, but private damage still could. He asked William, Harry, Meghan, and Catherine to meet once more, not to investigate, not to accuse, but to close the matter. The leak had already done its damage, but the final decision would determine whether that damage became another permanent royal fracture, or the moment the family finally learned where suspicion had to stop. The final Windsor meeting did not produce an apology dramatic enough for headlines, nor a punishment severe enough for those demanding scandal. Instead, it produced something harder, a boundary. Charles, William, Harry, Meghan, and Catherine confronted what had actually happened and separated it from everything they had feared. Meghan had asked questions that created understandable concern, but no evidence showed she obtained private correspondence. That distinction became the foundation of the decision, and the only way this Christmas crisis could finally end. Charles spoke first because he knew the family needed clarity, not another round of suspicion. The king said the repeated informal questions about restricted correspondence were inappropriate in such a sensitive environment, but they did not prove Meghan had tried to acquire, copy, or misuse private material. An internal review, meaning a private examination of what staff heard and what could actually be established, had reached its limit. The monarch made clear that fear could not be treated as evidence simply because the family had already been wounded by years of distrust. Meghan answered, without hiding behind Harry. She acknowledged that asking current and former employees about retained correspondence had created an appearance she should have anticipated. She accepted the new boundary, but firmly rejected the idea that she had been trying to obtain secret material. Harry supported her position and told Charles he wanted the episode closed rather than turned into another weapon in the wider family feud. The Duke had spent too long watching one dispute feed the next. William then confronted his own part in the damage. The prince told Meghan his concern had been genuine, especially when someone connected to his household was mentioned. But he admitted something harder. He had allowed fear of what might happen to become certainty about what had happened. Catherine quietly reinforced the distinction that had finally steadied the family. Asking whether something existed was not the same as taking it, requesting it, or exploiting it. Charles then imposed one rule for everyone. Questions about archived household material would now go through a designated formal channel, meaning an approved route where sensitive requests could be recorded and handled without involving staff informally. The king looked around the room, closed the briefing folder for the final time, and declared the review finished. William accepted it. Harry and Meghan accepted it. No disciplinary action followed. The Windsor banquet therefore ended up exposing something deeper than a hidden act of betrayal. It exposed how fragile royal trust had become, how quickly old wounds could turn uncertainty into accusation, and how easily fear could outrun facts. This time, however, the family stopped it before suspicion became permanent damage. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.